It's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. And we got our thinking caps on because we are going to use history to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones and foretell its future. Or is it the past? So, my last video, I talked about who Ramsay Bolton was and who Jon Snow was in history, and in fact, who Sansa is playing right now. And they are playing Richard III, Henry Tudor, and Margaret Beaufort. And in this time period, Richard III has taken the throne after he's gotten rid of the princes in the tower. And Henry Tudor is off somewhere trying to gather forces. Henry Tudor lands in the north with 2,000 mercenaries provided to him by the King of France. But that's obviously not enough forces to take on Richard III, who has at his disposal the army of several northern houses around England. And this includes the Northumberlands and the Stanleys. And who I think they are in the Game of Thrones is pretty freaking obvious, that the Umbers of the north are Northumberlands, and the Stanleys, I'm not sure if they're the Glovers. It sounds kind of how that's going to go. Something plain and simple will be the name of the person. But it might be the Karstarks, because the Karstarks are related to Jon Snow and the Stark family. And in history, the Stanleys were related by marriage. So Margaret Beaufort was on her fourth marriage. I want you to think about Sansa's numerous marriages so far. Was on her fourth marriage to Lord Stanley, who was nominally Richard's man, but Margaret Beaufort was continuously pressing him to support her son Henry VII. So Henry Tudor goes through Wales, which I believe will represent by the northern and the mountain territories, and he gathers up small bands of men from smaller houses, and he finally has this army, and he marches towards Bosworth Field. And there he meets Richard III in battle. Now, the truth of the matter is, Richard III had an advantage because obviously Henry Tudor's army had not fought together yet. And they didn't have a bunch of discipline, and they were still trying to pull it together, essentially. And Richard III had armies that had been bloodied in the War of the Roses. They were well trained, they were well supplied. So he had an advantage. He also had a small advantage in numbers. And when they met at Bosworth Field, the battle started. Henry Tudor had taken up a banner. And on this banner was the Dragon of Wales. The Dragon of Wales was on his banner. And this is how he'd gotten the Welsh to come and assist him. He was a son of the Welsh. His father and his uncle, Jasper and Edmund, were Welshmen, and they had served on the Welsh marches, and they were very comfortable, familiar, and friendly with a number of Welsh lords. So this is how Henry Tudor got his men. He had this dragon banner, and he was in battle, and they were duking it out. Now, at this point, Northumberland and the Stanleys were in reserve. Although the Stanleys had several men who were in the King's Guard. And in fact, they had been pressured by King Richard III to keep their allegiance. Instead of switching over to Henry VII, he made them give up a hostage. So this might be a case where the Umbers play the part of both the Northumberlands and the Stanleys, because they did give Ramsay, whom I'm saying is Richard III, a hostage. So they gave him a hostage. Richard III and Henry Tudor duking it out. And in reality, Henry Tudor isn't as much of a warrior as Richard III. He hasn't been in battle. Richard III has. Henry Tudor simply trained for it for practically all his life. And they are toe-to-toe in this battle. And it's anybody's question about who's going to win. although most everybody's fairly certain it's going to be Richard because he still has a lot of reserve forces. But here's the deal. The Stanleys had essentially pledged their loyalty to Richard III, given up a hostage, had been one of the sons. But then the brother of Lord Stanley had split and given his allegiance to Henry Tudor. So the Stanleys were rather infamous for splitting their loyalties and playing both sides. And it was somewhat of a smart idea because, you know, whoever won, if you were on the other side, you were going to be a traitor, your head might come off, and you would certainly lose your property, lands, and titles, and all that good stuff. So in any event, if you played both sides, whoever won, one of you was going to get to keep the family property. The Northumberlands now, Lord Northumberland, he had a reputation for being sick at critical moments and unavailable. Now, he might have had a real illness, but in any event, this illness may or may not have been convenient. And in fact, in this battle, that's exactly what happened. So he's in reserve. Richard III is toe-to-toe with Henry Tudor, and he calls up his forces because he's decided he sees Henry Tudor across the field, and he's got an opening, and he thinks Richard III, he's a very bold mover, and this is how he's got to the crown in the first place. He's a very bold mover, so he decides that he's going to charge right in the center and go right for Henry Tudor, and he'll just kill him, take his head, and eliminate the threat right at once and very quickly before any more of his forces are damaged. So he calls up upon the Stanleys and sends a message to the Northumberlands who are in reserve to come with him in this charge, and he starts moving forward. But the Stanleys do not respond. They stay on the side of the battlefield with all their forces. They're just there. They're just there. And Northumberland, in history, maybe he got the message, maybe he didn't. You know, they have a good story, right? They don't know. He was sick. So, but Richard III, now the momentum is going forward. He cannot stop and wait for these forces. He goes at Henry VII. Now they're toe-to-toe, and it looks like just maybe he's about to take Henry Tudor out when suddenly the Stanleys simply change sides. Lord Stanley gives a signal to his men, and they begin attacking Richard III's guard. That would be Ramsay in this story. Richard III's guard, and they're taking them out, and Richard III is calling for assistance, and nobody comes. And eventually he is hacked to frickin' pieces. Hacked to pieces. They smash his head inside his helmet. His helmet is smashed in so badly that really you couldn't have recognized his face if you'd wanted to. And his crown falls off. And Lord Stanley, as the battle ends, takes up this crown, and he goes to Henry Tudor, and he holds it over his head, and he crowns him King of England right on the battlefield. And of course, the Umbers, or Northumberlands, you know, they can plead that they didn't fight against Henry now the 7th. Please, mea culpa, don't take our lands. And they weren't, at least at first. There was some stuff later. And the Stanleys were rewarded for helping Henry Tudor gain the throne of England to become Henry VII. And then what he did was, dun, 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 he married Elizabeth York. So Henry Tudor of the Lancastrian house married Elizabeth York of the previously now deceased king, married their houses together, and ended the War of the Roses. And from their line and their actions, and I say theirs because in many cases without Elizabeth York, Henry VII probably would not have reigned so well. He had no clue about governing or anything like that. But from them came the line that saw the catalyst for change in England. So that's my thoughts. What we're going to see is we're going to see this battle, and the Umbers are going to be the Northumberlands and or the Stanleys together, or maybe we're going to see House Glover become the Stanleys. And the other thought is, how did Henry VII end up sitting on the throne, though he had really no royal English blood? His mother was, from France, a princess of France. She didn't have any direct English blood, but in fact, Margaret, not his mother, his grandmother, Valois, but Margaret Beaufort, indeed, was descended from John of Gaunt. And John of Gaunt also was an interesting story. You'll have to read him someday, but he fell in love with the governess of his children, and after they had multiple illegitimate children, and his wife finally died, he married her. And they ended up being one of the great love stories of that period, probably one of the few people that anybody ever said, that they knew might have married for love in the Middle Ages. And their children were originally illegitimate, but Henry IV had made them legitimate, but had tainted them or barred them from the line of succession. But that did not stop Henry Tudor, and he had a great propagandist, just like Tyrion Lannister, who told an awesome story about how Richard III was an evil frickin' king, and Henry VII came and saved England. That's it for now. I hope that tells you what you're probably going to see in the Battle of the Bastards. Talk to you later.